Hello, scholars. My name is Dr. Karis Dillon, and the goal of this channel is to make academic subjects easier to understand. For those of you that are homeschooling or teaching high school, please note the worksheets that you can purchase in the comments below this video. All of the U.S. government and U.S. history videos have worksheets that coincide with the videos. Now, on to George Washington and the beginning of U.S. government. In order to unify the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, Congress knew it needed to elect someone to the presidency that both sides viewed as acceptable. The perfect choice was George Washington, a military commander who had surrendered his sword to political leaders after the end of the Revolutionary War. The symbolism of this movement meant that the military and its leaders would be subservient to the national government. George Washington was officially elected the first president of the United States in February of 1789. He won all 69 electoral votes unanimously. What makes this even more interesting is that Washington wrote a letter to his friend Alexander Hamilton asking if he truly had to accept the nomination. He did not want to be president. Hamilton told him there was no way he couldn't accept the nomination. John Adams came in second with 34 votes, which made him the vice president. On April 30th, 1789, George Washington stepped out onto Cherry Street in New York City. He wore a brown suit and began to walk the streets toward Congress. It was the first presidential inauguration the nation would ever witness. The crowd shouted, "Long live George Washington," over and over again. Washington admitted this only made him feel more nervous and anxious about being the country's first president. He knew the nation had many problems that would be difficult to solve, but citizens felt more confident about him than he did about himself. The American people knew that Washington was extremely virtuous and put others' interests above his own. Washington wanted the presidential role to be dignified. He felt it right for there to be a certain level of pomp and circumstance that came with the presidency. Washington hosted balls and traveled with 6 white horses pulling his coach. He insisted on his title being simple, President George Washington, and didn't accept titles that sounded like those of a monarch. President George Washington wanted to surround himself with intelligent individuals, so he chose Alexander Hamilton as the Secretary of the Treasury. He also appointed Thomas Jefferson as the Secretary of State. Washington's relationship with Alexander Hamilton began when Washington read Hamilton's articles in the New York newspaper and offered him a position as an officer in the Continental Army when he was 21 years old. Hamilton later became a lawyer and was involved in the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. Washington trusted Hamilton and believed him to be a brilliant strategist and exceptionally good with money. This is why he wanted Hamilton as one of his advisors. To the Supreme Court, Washington appointed John Jay as his Chief Justice. Jay had vigorously defended the U.S. Constitution in his contributions to the Federalist Papers and was a New York lawyer, so Washington felt he had experience and intelligence. After a couple of years in office, President Washington made it a habit to meet regularly with all of these individuals, essentially setting the precedent for an executive cabinet. Vice President John Adams was quite upset because he spent his time residing over the Senate instead of being a part of these meetings. While the executive branch began discussing solving various problems within the nation, Congress knew they needed to start on the Bill of Rights. This was because many states had agreed to ratify the U.S. Constitution if there would be a Bill of Rights to be added immediately after that ratification. This was agreed upon, and so Congress moved forward to create the Bill of Rights. If you'd like to see or view the Bill of Rights, please check out my video, The 27 Amendments of the Constitution, which are on my channel, Dr. Karis Dillon. James Madison believed the integration of the Bill of Rights would help to heal the rift between the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist ideals. Madison gathered the state constitutions that included a Bill of Rights and began drafting amendments. He included the freedom of speech, assembly, petition, and religion. Madison also included restrictions concerning illegal searches and seizures. By September of 1789, Congress approved 12 amendments and relayed them to all the states to be ratified. Madison was quite dismayed when he received drafts of various amendments from different states. Madison had made it clear to the states that they needed to either vote for or against these particular amendments. In the end, 10 amendments were ratified and named the Bill of Rights. 17 other amendments have been added since the ratification of the Bill of Rights. While members of Congress worked diligently on the Bill of Rights, Alexander Hamilton sought to solve the economic problems of the nation. The biggest issue still facing the nation economically was paying back the Revolutionary War debts. Hamilton decided to create a national bank that could control the supply of money and spur industrial development. The federal bank could control credit, the value of currency, as well as interest rates. Hamilton was able to secure a couple of big loans from large banks and was better able to track trade, which meant being able to secure tax revenues at a greater rate. Luckily, the 1790s brought about technological advances in farming, which brought about additional sources of income to the nation. In 1793, a man by the name of Eli Whitney created the cotton gin, which was a machine that could separate the seeds out of the cotton. This greatly reduced the time spent preparing the cotton for sale. Once the cotton was seed-free, Americans could sell this product to Great Britain, who had factories that made it into textiles. Instead of sending over 100,000 pounds of cotton to Great Britain, America could now send over 30 million pounds of cotton to English factories. Surprisingly, cotton wasn't the only product that was in great demand during the 1790s. The French Revolution in Europe and continual discourse between France and Great Britain left production of grain at extremely low levels. American farmers benefited as Europe's demand for grain sent international prices higher than before. This created an onslaught of new jobs for many Americans. Along with the advances in agriculture came improvements in transportation and trade. When the U.S. Postal Service was established in 1792, it became evident that more roads needed to be built. Not only did the government build roads, but private companies did as well. The roads were made of gravel, dirt, or planks. A majority of the roads were first built in southern New England as well as mid-Atlantic states. These were the first cities to become connected via roads. Commercial stagecoach companies greatly increased in numbers. The first toll road was created from Lancaster, Pennsylvania to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The tremendous advances of the 1790s meant that the war debt might soon be eliminated. The U.S. government owed more than $50 million to various creditors. As the government gained money, so did its individual citizens. During the decade before the 19th century, the number of banks multiplied by 10. These banks were able to make money by selling stocks. They created loans that were backed by gold and silver that stockholders gave in. Alexander Hamilton needed to make sure that all the old war debts were paid off in the nation and issued a report on public credit in January of 1790. Hamilton wanted to make sure all the certificates in debt from the war were paid in full. This was not a popular idea to other politicians, as many soldiers sold off their war certificates for much less than what they were worth. Hamilton wanted to roll over the war certificates into new bonds that would be secured by the U.S. government. This meant those that had bought these new bonds, the investors, would hold the national debt, but would also have a stake in the new nation. This would bring millions of dollars into the nation's economy. Hamilton eventually had to send out officers across the nation looking for any old certificates from the Revolutionary War that were held by others. The executive and legislative branches were shocked when the stock went on sale in Boston, New York City, and Philadelphia and sold out within a couple of hours. Stock prices increased rapidly and then fell again. Citizens started gambling with the stocks and to the great frustration of the federal government. Another way that Hamilton attempted to gain revenues for the federal government was to pass a 25% excise tax on whiskey. This meant that when farmers brought their grain to the distillery, there would be a tax on the product. Members of Congress generally agreed with this tax for varying reasons. Madison liked the tax because he hoped it would sober people up. The tax was extremely unpopular for grain farmers and whiskey drinkers throughout the nation. Farmers from many states showed their resentment of the tax, but Congress only decreased it by a little. The farmers remained angry. Most of the farmers and distillery workers just ignored the tax. Many did not report their production accurately. When Hamilton decided to tighten the regulations on the taxes, farmers grew furious. This is when 7,000 farmers decided to march on Pittsburgh in a revolt against the taxes. President Washington was immediately set into action. He activated the Pennsylvania militia and jumped on a horse, leading 13,000 soldiers to Pittsburgh. By the time he finally arrived, most of the protesters had gone home. Washington and the soldiers rounded up 20 men and charged them with treason. 2 of them were convicted, but Washington eventually pardoned them. Most of the individuals in Congress believed that Washington had overreacted. The Whiskey Rebellion, as the protest was later named, allowed the federal government to show its powers against those that resisted. While the nation argued over various taxes and attempted to improve means of transport, problems continued on the land still inhabited by the Native Americans. When the population of the nation doubled, there were more people wanting to move west, especially into Ohio. The U.S. Army wanted to clear the Native American tribes out of this region and built Fort Washington in 1789 near the present-day city of Cincinnati. U.S. Army General St. Clair attempted to clear the area around the Wabash River, but it became an American bloodbath. The Indians killed 900 soldiers and dismembered the dead, sometimes by scalping them. Congress was dumbstruck and extremely dismayed. Washington demanded the resignation of General St. Clair, but Congress still issued its first subpoena against the executive branch. The stories American soldiers brought back to others were absolutely terrifying. Congress demanded to know what had gone wrong. President George Washington decided it was time to double the amount of troops in that region and put General Anthony Wayne in charge. He established a couple of military camps with 3,500 men. These forts were named Fort Recovery and Fort Greenville. Fort Recovery was the site of the bloodbath between General St. Clair and various Native American tribes. There were still body parts present when the troops arrived. When Native Americans attempted to ambush these soldiers, the Native Americans didn't have any weapons, and because of this, they were slaughtered. These tribes gave up when soldiers burned their crops and villages. They decided that negotiations in 1795 would be best for them. The government offered $25,000 in goods such as blankets, alcohol, ribbons, kettles, shirts, wine, and knives. They promised to give the tribes goods each year if they kept the treaty. Over time, the government provided more and more alcohol and less other materials. Native Americans lost many of its members to the community because of this alcohol. As more divisiveness grew between the two opposing ideologies, President Washington decided against a third term. In the election of 1796, John Adams ran against Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Pinckney, and Aaron Burr. Adams and Pinckney were favored by the Federalists. Burr and Jefferson were favored by the Republicans. John Adams won the presidency, and Thomas Jefferson became the vice president. It was surprising that Adams won because his personality did not always appeal to people. He was temperamental and didn't take criticism well. Adams attempted to create unity by promising to keep foreign relations neutral. He also kept certain cabinet members that were from Washington's original team. Vice President Jefferson was so put off by Adams and his cabinet that he really didn't participate much in those discussions. In 1778, France broke an alliance with the U.S. because it was cooperating with Great Britain and carrying British goods on its ship. In 1 year, France seized 300 American ships that were carrying these goods. Many citizens believed that a war with France was the only option. Adams sent commissioners to France to attempt a diplomatic measure, but the French refused to see them. French agents later approached the American commissioners and told them that $250,000 and a loan for $12 million would really help with the peace treaty, and the American commissioners took that information back to the president. They nicknamed the agents X, Y, and Z, and the story completely upset the American nation. In 1798, U.S. naval ships entered the Caribbean and captured about 100 French ships in a quasi-war of sorts. The addition of U.S. soldiers worried Republicans who believed that President Adams was going to use the army for his own ideological purposes. Pro-French mobs started to roam around the capital in resistance, and Adams started to fear for his life, hiding weapons at home and as well at work. Those Federalists with influence came in to try and stifle the heated atmosphere. In 1798, Congress moved quickly to write and pass the Sedition Act, which made it illegal to speak or write anything that went against the President of the United States or Congress. It also made any revolt illegal as well. No one was allowed to criticize government leaders, and 25 men were eventually charged with sedition. Congress also worked hard to pass 2 Alien Acts. The first Alien Act meant that aliens would have to wait 5 to 14 years to attain citizenship. The second Alien Act allowed the president to imprison any potential dangerous alien during a time of war. Citizens knew the Sedition and Alien Acts were meant to scare French immigrants that were already in the U.S., but also discourage more immigrants from coming to the U.S. Adams held strong and did not declare war on France, and finally, a peace settlement was agreed upon in 1800. Federalists did not seem pleased with the peace settlement between the U.S. and France. John Adams was not elected for a second term as President of the United States. The election of 1800 paired Thomas Jefferson against John Adams. Thomas Jefferson won the presidency and attempted to unify the nation by stating that all citizens had Federalist as well as Republican ideologies. The nation and its ideologies really shifted during the last decade before the 19th century. A majority of Americans lived in the rural area upon farms where they made their own clothes and grew their own crops. Only 5% of the population lived in cities. Owning property was extremely important to Americans, and passing on the farmland to future generations was the goal. Farming villages near farms presented a place where farmers could sell their goods to others and buy what they needed. The questions concerning slavery and women's rights surfaced during this decade in American history as well. Virginia and South Carolina's populations were still made up of 50% slaves. The business ties with the South were very important to the North, so the question of slavery was especially difficult. All right, well, we're going to stop here because Thomas Jefferson has quite a few things that end up in his presidency, so we're going to save that for our next video. If you like this video, please click on that like button and don't forget to subscribe, and I will talk with you soon. Bye-bye.